Two white cops corner Marcus Johnson on his own front lawn, accusing him of trespassing, hands twitching toward their holsters as they demand ID. Marcus, unflinching, locks eyes with them, calm but razor sharp. The twist: he's the FBI director, the nation's top lawman. What happens when racial bias slams into unyielding power? Like, share, and subscribe to unravel this explosive showdown. The evening was calm, the kind of quiet suburban night where even the crickets seemed to sing in harmony. Inside his modest but elegant home, Marcus Hill, a tall black man in his 50s with broad shoulders and a steady presence, slipped off his tie and hung his jacket neatly by the door. It had been another long day of endless meetings, policy briefings, and delicate negotiations work. He carried silently on his back, work nobody in this neighborhood had the faintest idea about. For Marcus, this house was his sanctuary. He poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and let out a deep sigh. For a brief moment, he allowed himself the luxury of peace, just a man at home, no titles, no responsibilities, no battles to fight. Then, without warning, the tranquility shattered. Bright beams of headlights flooded through his living room window, slicing across the walls. Marcus frowned, setting the glass down. The sound of a car door slamming echoed in the night. Out on the driveway, two white police officers emerged. Officer Blake, sharp-jawed and cocky, walked ahead with the swagger of someone who already believed he owned the ground he stepped on. Behind him was Officer Turner, younger, quieter, but with the kind of gaze that followed his partner's lead without question. Blake cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted toward the porch. "Hey, you there! What are you doing on this property?" Marcus stepped outside, calm but puzzled, the warm light from his porch outlining his frame. "Excuse me?" he asked evenly. "This is my home." Blake smirked, exchanging a quick glance with Turner. "Your home? That's funny. We got a call about a suspicious black male trespassing. Matches your description perfectly." The words cut sharp, deliberate. Marcus inhaled slowly, refusing to let his temper surface. "I live here. My name is Marcus Hill. You can check the records if you'd like." Turner muttered, "Always the same story," shaking his head. Blake stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, not drawing, but enough to remind Marcus of the power imbalance. "Let's see some ID." "Then, right now," Blake barked. Marcus's jaw tightened. Inside, a storm brewed, but he kept his voice measured. "I came from work. My wallet's inside. You can wait here while I get it." Blake narrowed his eyes, leaning in just a little too close. "How convenient. You just forgot your ID. Listen, buddy, trespassing is a crime. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Marcus locked eyes with him, refusing to break his calm. "I'm not trespassing. This is my home. I've lived here for years." The silence stretched heavy. Turner shifted uncomfortably, but Blake's smirk widened, feeding off the tension. Then came the first snap of escalation. Blake suddenly grabbed Marcus by the arm, twisting it sharply. The porch light caught the veins standing out on Marcus's forearm as he instinctively tensed. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus demanded, his deep voice steady but edged with fire. Blake sneered, tightening his grip. "Exactly what it looks like. You think standing there all calm makes you innocent. I've seen your type. Too quiet, too smug, like you're better than the law." Marcus stood firm, refusing to be yanked forward. "Take your hand off me." The words weren't shouted, they were controlled, almost whispered, but the weight behind them was undeniable. For the first time, Turner hesitated. His eyes flickered between Blake's grip and Marcus's unflinching stare. Something about Marcus didn't fit the picture painted by the suspicious trespasser call, but Blake, fueled by arrogance, only pulled harder. "Don't test me. You're going to regret that tone." Marcus exhaled through his nose, forcing himself not to react. With the strength, he carried the authority he commanded, in a world these officers couldn't begin to imagine. Instead, he let the absurdity hang in the air. The vision of a black man accused of trespassing on his own porch. The crickets had gone silent now. The neighborhood lights flicked on, one by one, curious eyes peeking through curtains. In that charged moment, calm clashing against aggression, dignity against prejudice, the audience could already sense this was no ordinary misunderstanding. This was a spark, and the fire was just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights spread across the quiet street, painting the tidy houses in a harsh glow. Within minutes, curtains began to shift, and front doors creaked open. Neighbors stepped outside, whispering, phones in hand, curiosity tugging them closer to Marcus's yard. At first it was just murmurs, but the murmurs carried weight. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt muttered under his breath, "What's he doing here at this hour?" Another woman whispered to her friend, loud enough to be heard, "You think he really owns this place? Looks out of place, doesn't he?" The crowd grew, faces illuminated by the cold glow of phone screens. Some lifted their devices, recording as if this were entertainment, not a man's dignity, unraveling under flashing lights. Mrs. Dalton, the oldest neighbor on the block, stepped forward. Her voice cracked with disbelief, sharp and cutting. "Officers, are you sure he lives here? I've seen him around, but, I mean, really, this house." Her words hung in the air like poison, feeding the doubts already festering among the crowd. Marcus didn't flinch. His hands remained steady at his sides, his breathing calm but controlled. The silence in his stance was louder than any protest, and it only fueled the tension. Officer Blake seized the moment, turning to the crowd with a smug grin. "See, even the neighbors aren't sure. That tells you everything." The words stung. The line between authority and prejudice blurred in that instant, and the air grew heavier. From the back of the crowd, a small voice broke through. A boy no older than 7 clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide with innocence fixed on Marcus. "Mom," he whispered, though everyone could hear, "why are they tying him up in his own yard?" The mother froze her lips, pressed tight, unable to answer. That one question, so pure, so piercing, cut deeper than any insult. Even some of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, realizing what the scene truly looked like. But not all of them. A young man in a baseball cap scoffed, "Kids too young to understand. This is what happens when you don't follow the law." The divide was clear now, some siding with the uniform, others awakening to the injustice unfolding before them. Marcus finally raised his head, his eyes locking with the boys. He said nothing, but the look he gave carried weight, a mix of sorrow, strength, and restraint. It was a look that said, "I see you. I won't break. Not here, not now." The crowd leaned in, waiting for him to speak, to shout, to resist. But Marcus chose silence. And that silence unsettled everyone, the officers, the neighbors, even the boy holding his mother's hand. Officer Turner yanked Marcus's wrist tighter, snapping at him, "What, you got nothing to say for yourself? Playing the quiet type, huh? That won't save you." The harsh grip left a red mark blooming across Marcus's dark skin. Yet still he remained calm, standing tall though bound. And in that stillness, the tension thickened. The neighbors weren't just watching anymore. They were part of it. They were witnesses to a scene that mirrored a history they'd rather not confront. Suspicion, humiliation, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to give them the outburst they were pushing for. The crowd buzzed with nervous energy, the weight of Marcus's silence pressing down on every whispered word, every doubtful glance. It was no longer just a police encounter. It was a mirror held up to the entire community. The moment they crossed the threshold, it no longer felt like Marcus's home. 2 white officers barged through the doorway without knocking, boots pounding against the polished wood floor. They claimed they were searching for evidence of forced entry. But the irony was bitter. Marcus was the homeowner. There had been no break-in, no crime, no cause. Still, they stormed inside as if the very walls belonged to them. Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish towel. Her face drained of color the instant she saw the officers rifling through drawers and peering down hallways. "This is our home," she pleaded, voice unsteady. "You can't just..." One officer spun toward her, his jaw tight. "Ma'am, step aside or you'll be charged with obstruction." The threat silenced her, though her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. Her eyes darted to Marcus, desperate, terrified. Marcus held her gaze. He didn't speak, not yet, but in the calm firmness of his eyes, Evelyn saw it. "I promise, I won't let them break us." The officers grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him toward the door. Evelyn stumbled forward instinctively, her hand reaching out, but she froze when another officer raised a hand toward his cuffs as if to warn her, "One more step and you're next." They dragged Marcus out of his own living room, past the family photos on the wall, past the door frame he had painted with his own hands. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder now, their voices no longer hushed. "This is his house," someone shouted. "He didn't break in. He lives here," another yelled, their anger rising with every second. Some filmed with shaking hands, others just watched in disbelief. Children clung to their parents' legs, eyes wide as if trying to understand how a man could be arrested in the very place that bore his name on the mortgage. Evelyn's cries cut through the noise. Her voice cracked raw and desperate. You can't take him. This is his home, but the officers didn't pause. To them, Marcus was already reduced to the sound of clinking handcuffs and the weight of their grip on his arms. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a performance, a public shaming. They weren't just dragging Marcus out. They were sending a message to every black family watching. Even your home isn't safe. Even your dignity can be taken. The crowd's outrage grew, but so did the silence between Marcus and Evelyn. Their eyes locked one last time as he was forced toward the waiting cruiser. In that silence was something stronger than words, a vow that the truth would not stay buried forever. The back of the cruiser was colder than it should have been. The steel cuffs dug into Marcus's wrists and the plastic seat beneath him creaked every time the car turned. To anyone passing on the street, he looked like just another man in custody. But to those of us who saw the whole scene unfold, it was clear this wasn't justice. This was humiliation served cold. In the front seats, Officer Blake gripped the wheel with one hand while the other tapped against the dash in rhythm with his words. He chuckled low, then said, "You see that crowd? That's what happens when you put a man like him in his place." Turner leaned back in the passenger seat, turning halfway to glance at Marcus through the wire mesh. His smirk was cruel, the kind that dared you to respond. Yeah, bet he'll think twice before stepping out of line again. A night in a cell ought to remind him where he belongs. Their laughter filled the cruiser, sharp cutting like knives against glass. But Marcus didn't answer. He didn't rise to their bait. He sat with his back straight, shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the window. The flashing city lights streaked across the glass as the car moved through the streets, casting quick shadows over his face. And in that silence, something shifted. Blake and Turner thought they were proving dominance, but the quiet dignity in Marcus's posture told another story. He wasn't broken. He wasn't pleading. If anything, he looked untouchable, like a man holding a truth they couldn't see. Turner's voice hardened. "What cat got your tongue? Or maybe you know better than to mouth off now." Still nothing, not a word, just that calm gaze on the passing lights. And here's the thing, sometimes silence can be louder than shouting. It unsettled them, though they'd never admit it. Because Marcus's quiet wasn't fear, it was defiance. The kind that made you wonder who you were really dealing with. By then, word of the arrest was already moving faster than the cruiser itself. One of the neighbors, an older man with shaky hands but steady conviction, had filmed everything on his phone. From the moment the officers barged into Marcus's home to the second they dragged him out. Within minutes, that video was online. At first, it was just a handful of shares, angry comments, calls for justice. But soon, the ripple spread wider. The story wasn't just local anymore. It was traveling, finding its way into feeds and timelines, stirring questions far beyond that quiet neighborhood street. And Marcus, sitting in the back seat, seemed to know it. He hadn't seen the phone, hadn't heard the shares climbing, but there was something in his stillness, in the steady way he breathed, that felt almost deliberate, like he was waiting, like this was all part of something bigger. Blake turned up the radio, country music spilling through the speakers, trying to drown out the tension. But the truth was, the silence in the back seat was heavier than the noise. Turner shot one last glance at Marcus and muttered under his breath, "Arrogant." But it wasn't arrogance. It was strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, no matter how others try to strip it away. The cruiser rolled on toward the station, its sirens off its prisoners and captors locked in a strange, quiet battle of wills. The officers thought they were in control. But to anyone who looked closely, the power didn't sit in the front seats at all. It sat in the back, in the silence, in the man who refused to bow. The fluorescent lights inside the station hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over the booking room. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, that particular odor of bureaucracy and neglect that clung to every police station I'd ever stepped in. But that night it felt heavier, colder. Marcus was led inside, wrists still bound in steel, his back straight, his head unbowed. The officers who had dragged him in, Blake and Turner, wore smug grins as if they had just brought down a trophy. They shoved him toward the desk where a clerk waited with paperwork. "You know the drill," Turner muttered, pulling the chain tight before forcing Marcus to sit. "Print him, mug him, then let him rot." The clerk, barely looking up, began typing. Every keystroke echoed like a gavel striking wood. The routine was carried out not with professionalism, but with contempt, as if Marcus were not a man, but an inconvenience. His belongings were dumped into a tray. His name was called out flatly stamped onto forms. His silence only seemed to annoy them more. Officer Blake leaned in, sneering. "What's the matter, cat got your tongue? Thought you'd at least beg a little before we lock you up." Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze rested on the wall behind Blake, on some meaningless spot of chipped paint. His silence was not submission, it was defiance wrapped in calm. The room grew uneasy in ways the officers couldn't quite name. Then the air shifted. The door opened and Captain Harris stepped inside. His presence filled the room not with dignity, but with authority sharpened by arrogance. Harris was a tall, heavy-set man with graying hair and a permanent scowl that seemed to warn against questioning him. "Report," he barked. Blake straightened, eager. "Caught him breaking and entering, sir. Resisting too. Got him good." Harris didn't bother asking for details, didn't bother checking evidence. He simply grabbed the file, skimmed the first page, and scribbled his signature across the bottom. "Hold him overnight. We'll figure out the rest later." It was too quick, too careless. Harris had just signed away Marcus's freedom as if it were nothing more than paperwork. And maybe to him it was. From the corner of the room, someone shifted. Officer Reed, a young black officer no more than 25, stood half hidden near the door. His uniform looked crisp, almost too new, his posture tense. His eyes, though, they weren't on the paperwork. They were locked on Marcus. Something flickered across Reed's face. Recognition. Unease. As if he knew this man wasn't just another booking number to be filed away. He glanced at Harris, then at Marcus, his jaw tightening. Marcus noticed. For the first time since being dragged into that room, he let his lips curve into the faintest trace of a smile. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't bitter, it was calm, almost kind. The kind of smile that carried weight because it didn't belong in a place like this. Then in a voice low but steady, Marcus spoke. "Are you sure?" Just 3 words. But they cracked through the room like thunder. Blake blinked. Turner frowned. Even the clerk stopped typing mid-keystroke. Captain Harris narrowed his eyes. "What did you just say?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands still cuffed, his tone unchanged. "I asked if you're sure." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one understood why those words carried so much gravity, but they did. The question wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about choices. Decisions that couldn't be undone once they were written in ink. Officer Reed swallowed hard, his fingers flexing against his belt. He looked like a man torn between duty and conscience, between staying quiet or stepping forward. He knew something. Everyone could see it in his eyes. Harris scoffed, breaking the tension with forced authority. "Don't play games with me, son. You're not in control here." But Marcus didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still calm, smile still faint, as if Harris's words had proven his point. The booking room had become a stage, and Marcus, with just a whisper, had shifted the script. The officers tried to resume their tasks, but the atmosphere refused to return to normal. The printer jammed. A pen slipped from Turner's hand. Blake muttered curses under his breath, louder than usual. Reed kept glancing over like a man staring at a fuse burning toward dynamite. Everyone in that room felt it, that something was wrong. That this wasn't just another arrest. And as Marcus sat there bound but unbroken, his silence, heavier than any protest, the seeds of unease grew deeper. The audience watching too would feel it. This was no ordinary man. His stillness was not weakness. It was a storm waiting for the right moment to break. The next morning, the courthouse was already buzzing before the doors even opened. Word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors had shared the shaky phone video online, and now news crews were camped out front. The footage showed Marcus being handcuffed without resistance, officers sneering at him as though he were less than human. People came not just to witness a trial, but to witness whether justice still had any meaning. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocating with tension. Rows of spectators filled the benches, whispers bouncing off the walls. The officers who arrested Marcus Blake and Turner sat tall at the prosecution table, smug grins plastered across their faces. They whispered to each other like schoolboys who thought the prank they'd pulled would never catch up to them. "Looks like the circus showed up," Turner muttered under his breath, smirking at the crowd. Blake leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his voice dripping with arrogance. Don't worry. Coleman will back us up. He always does. Then came the sound of the gavel. Judge Coleman, a stern white man in his late 60s, entered the room with an expression as rigid as stone. His eyes barely glanced at Marcus before he sat down, already radiating a cold disapproval. All rise, the bailiff commanded. The room stood. Then with one sharp rap, Coleman announced, be seated. As Marcus was led to the defense table, he remained silent, his posture upright, almost regal, despite the handcuffs still hanging loosely around his wrists. He didn't flinch. He didn't bow his head. He simply looked forward, his face unreadable. That silence carried weight and unsettling calm that made even the spectators restless. The prosecutor wasted no time rising with false confidence. Your Honor, the defendant was caught trespassing on private property and resisting lawful orders. The evidence is clear. We request immediate sentencing. Immediate sentencing. No trial, no testimony. Just a stamp of approval. Judge Coleman leaned forward, his voice sharp. Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say in your defense? It was the first time Marcus was directly addressed. The room fell into an eerie hush, as though everyone leaned forward at once. Evelyn, sitting in the back, clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. Marcus finally spoke, his tone calm, but laced with something deeper, something that unsettled the room. Do you truly want me to answer that question? Your Honor, the judge's eyes narrowed. This is not the time for games. You'll answer directly or I'll consider your silence an admission of guilt. For a moment, Marcus simply held his gaze. Then he gave the faintest of smiles. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any defense. The crowd stirred. A murmur rolled across the benches. Some nodded, sensing there was more to Marcus than anyone realized. Judge Coleman slammed the gavel, irritated. Order in the court. If the defendant insists on wasting this court's time, then I will proceed without him. Blake leaned toward Turner again, his grin widening. Told you, he's finished. But then Evelyn rose from her seat, unable to remain silent. Her voice, though trembling, carried conviction. Your Honor, this isn't justice, it's theater. You're not even allowing him to speak. The judge's face hardened. Sit down, ma'am, or I'll have you removed. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated, but her eyes met Marcus's, and he gave her a subtle nod, almost as if to say not yet. With a deep breath, she sat back down, though her eyes burned with restrained fire. The cameras clicked, capturing every moment. Reporters scribbled furiously. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a spectacle unraveling before the nation's eyes. Then came the subtle but chilling moment. Officer Reed, the young black officer who had seen Marcus at the station, entered quietly through the side door. His eyes found Marcus instantly, and the color drained from his face. He recognized something the others did not. Marcus caught his gaze, then tilted his head slightly and spoke just loud enough for the front rows to hear, You all believe you've won, but ask yourselves this, why am I still calm? The question hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it pierced deeper than any outburst could. And for the first time, the arrogance on Blake's face faltered. The courtroom was heavy with arrogance that morning. The officers sat forward in their seats, like men ready to bask in a victory they believed already belonged to them. Their lawyer droned on, painting Marcus as a trespasser, a troublemaker, who had refused lawful orders. Every word felt rehearsed hollow, yet laced with confidence. Judge Coleman leaned back in her chair, eyes cool and unimpressed with Marcus. The gavel tapped once. Proceed, she said, her tone flat but already leaning in the officer's favor. Marcus sat there silent, as he had been all along. His shoulders squared, his chin steady. Not once did he look rattled. If anything, the calm on his face was sharper than the anger of the men accusing him. Evelyn sat in the back, her hands clenched together. You could see the fire in her eyes, but also the dread of knowing how often justice tipped the wrong way. Then it happened. While the prosecutor recited charges, Marcus slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The room seemed to hold its breath. A murmur swept the crowd, cameras tilted in his direction. The officers exchanged grins, thinking he was breaking court protocol, about to embarrass himself further. But when his hand emerged, it carried not defiance, it carried authority. A small, dark blue identification wallet, the kind that spoke louder than any attorney. He placed it on the defense table with deliberate calm, then slid it forward for all to see. The court clerk picked it up, first confused before turning pale. She whispered to the bailiff. The bailiff's eyes widened, and then he stepped back as though the leather burned his hands. Judge Coleman narrowed her eyes. "What is this?" Marcus finally rose to his feet. For the first time since his arrest, his voice filled the courtroom, steady, rich, impossible to ignore. "You wanted to know who I am." He took the badge back, snapped it open, and held it high enough for the cameras. The golden letters gleamed under the fluorescent lights, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus Hill. Gasps rippled across the benches like a shockwave. Reporters nearly fell over themselves, scrambling for the shot. Half the audience stood instinctively as though witnessing history in real time. The officers, their smirks collapsed instantly. Turner's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Blake's jaw worked like he wanted to shout, but his throat betrayed him. And Judge Coleman, her gavel slipped from her hand and clattered to the bench, the sound echoing like thunder in the stunned silence. Marcus's eyes swept the room, not with pride, not with arrogance, but with the weight of something heavier. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he spoke again, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "If this is how you treat me, a man with the power to walk into any federal building in this country," he paused, letting the words sink deep, "then imagine what you do to the ones who have no title, no badge, no shield, the ones with no voice but their own." The gallery trembled with murmurs. Some nodded, some covered their mouths in shock. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill, because she knew in that moment her husband wasn't just fighting for himself, he was exposing the system itself. Officer Blake suddenly shouted, his voice cracking under panic. "He's lying. That can't be real. This is a setup." But his words drowned beneath the rustle of reporters, the camera shutters clicking like machine gun fire, and the collective disbelief that had turned into outrage. Judge Coleman tried to regain order, slamming her gavel down again and again, though her hand trembled. "Order, order," in the court she barked, but the command rang hollow. Her authority in that instant had been eclipsed. Marcus didn't sit back down. He stood tall, the badge still in his hand, his gaze locked on the very men who had shackled him hours earlier. "You thought you could strip me of dignity with your cuffs and your mockery, but what you exposed was yourselves." Turner looked down at the table, sweat beading across his forehead. Blake's face burned red, not from pride, but from fear, the kind that gnawed at the heart when power slipped away. And then Marcus delivered the line that silenced even the most cynical heart in that room. "This courtroom isn't just witnessing my trial, it's witnessing yours. You could have heard a pin drop. Every soul in that chamber knew at that moment the story had turned. The officers weren't hunters anymore. They were prey. The balance of power had flipped in front of the nation's eyes, and there was no going back." By dawn, the footage was everywhere. News anchors leaned forward over their desks, voices sharp with disbelief. Breaking overnight, FBI Director Marcus Hill wrongfully arrested inside his own courtroom. Clips of the arrest looped endlessly, the handcuffs clicking shut. Marcus's silence, and then that moment. The flash of his FBI ID, the collective gasp, the judge's face draining of color. America could not look away. On Twitter, one line exploded into a rallying cry. "If the FBI director can be treated like this, what hope do the rest of us have?" By mid-morning, the police department was in chaos. Every officer involved had been suspended. Captain Harris's name was plastered across headlines, his face shown on every major network. Reporters camped outside the precinct, shouting questions he never answered. One neighbor who had once mocked Marcus stopped by his house that afternoon. His voice trembled as he stammered, I didn't know, Marcus. I thought you were just a regular guy." Marcus looked him dead in the eye. His reply was soft, almost too soft. "That's the problem, isn't it? You only respect me now because of a title." The man lowered his head, unable to respond. That evening, Marcus stepped onto his porch. Reporters surged forward, microphones, raised cameras, blinking like fireflies in the dark. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand locked into his. She said nothing, but her presence was unshakable, calm, proud, unbreakable. Marcus's voice cut through the crowd like steel wrapped in velvet. "I will not let this story be written as if I am the victim," he began. "Because I am not. What happened to me is the daily reality for millions who don't carry a badge, who don't wear a title. I am not standing here for myself. I am standing here for them." He paused. The only sound was the clicking of cameras. I was mocked, restrained, and humiliated. Not because I broke the law, but because of the color of my skin. If this system can do that to me, what chance does a young man on a street corner have? What chance does a mother driving home have? What chance does a veteran in uniform have? A reporter shouted from the crowd. Director Hill, what's your message to the officers who did this? Marcus's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening just slightly. My message. Look at yourselves in the mirror tonight. And know that what you did has exposed the very sickness you were sworn to fight. You didn't just put me in chains, you chained your own integrity. The words hit like a hammer. Even the reporters, seasoned and cynical, fell silent. Another voice broke in, trembling. What comes next? Marcus didn't hesitate. Accountability, not just for the men who put their hands on me, but for the system that told them they could. This moment cannot end with me walking free and everyone else going back to business as usual. No, this is bigger than me. Much bigger. Evelyn gripped his arm tighter. Her eyes glistened under the camera lights, but there was fire in them. She leaned in close and whispered, though the microphone still caught it, they tried to break you. But tonight the world sees who truly broke. The press went wild, shouting, flashing, pushing forward. But Marcus simply raised his hand steady, commanding silence. I want every American watching this to remember one thing he said, his voice now low, almost a whisper. Dignity does not come from a title. It is a right. And when that right is denied, none of us are safe. The crowd erupted, some reporters clapping despite themselves. That night, as broadcast replayed his words, living rooms across the country fell quiet. Some nodded in agreement, some sat in shame, but none could escape the truth of what they had witnessed. It was no longer just a story of an arrest. It was the mirror of a nation, ugly, raw, and undeniable. I remember the room was quiet that evening. No shouting, no chaos, just the kind of silence that presses down heavy because everyone knows they're about to hear something that matters. Marcus sat there in front of the camera. No polished stage, no fancy backdrop, just a man, a chair, and the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The same man who had walked into a courtroom in chains was now sitting tall, his eyes steady, his voice carrying that mix of calm and fire. He leaned forward, and for a moment it felt like he was talking directly to each of us. I want to make something clear, he began. His tone measured the words unhurried. What happened to me was not an isolated mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the product of a system that has been broken for far too long. The camera zoomed in just slightly. You could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also something unshakable. No one, Marcus said, his voice tightening, no one, not even the director of the FBI, should be treated like a stranger in his own house. And yet I was. The words landed heavy. He paused, letting them sink in. This isn't about rank. It isn't about titles. It's about humanity. Because if the highest office in federal law enforcement can be disrespected, then what chance does the young man walking home at night have? What chance does the woman pulled over for a broken taillight have? What chance does the veteran wearing his country's uniform have? He let that question hang. You could almost feel the country holding its breath. Then he shifted softer now, almost pleading. This cannot end with outrage. Outrage fades. What we need is reform. What we need is accountability. What we need is to finally say enough. For a moment, the camera caught his wife, Evelyn, standing just off to the side. She wasn't speaking, but her presence spoke volumes. Her eyes never left him, steady and fierce like she had carried half his burden all along. Marcus turned back to the lens, his voice sharpening. I am not here tonight as a director. I am here as a husband, as a father, as a black man in America. And I am telling you, this fight is not about me. It is about us, all of us. He leaned closer and his voice dropped almost a whisper. The measure of justice is not how it treats the powerful. It's how it protects the powerless. That line, people would quote it for weeks. It was clipped, shared, turned into headlines. But in that moment, it was raw and alive, like the kind of truth you can't polish or rehearse. When he finished, he didn't shout. He didn't raise his hands. He simply sat back, folded his fingers together, and let silence do the rest. And that silence was louder than any applause. The reaction was immediate. Churches lit candles. Marches filled the streets. Black, white, young, old standing shoulder to shoulder. Not in anger alone, but in unity. Signs lifted into the air carried his words. Dignity is a right. No more strangers in our own house. It was as if the whole country had been waiting for someone to say what they already knew, but hadn't found the voice for. And Marcus had given them that voice. The next morning, lawmakers began speaking of hearings. Civil rights leaders called for new legislation. Even some officers, those who had spent their lives inside the badge, stepped forward and admitted quietly that he was right. But what I'll never forget wasn't in the halls of Congress or on the news broadcasts. It was outside the courthouse just a few days later. Marcus and Evelyn walked out together. No cameras this time, no podium, just the two of them hand in hand. The sun was setting, spilling gold across the courthouse steps. He paused for a moment at the top, looking out, not at reporters, not at officials, but at people. Ordinary people who had gathered in the hundreds. Some were clapping, some were crying, many just stood in silence watching. And then he smiled. Not wide, not for show, just that quiet, tired smile of a man who knew the fight was far from over, but also knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore. He squeezed Evelyn's hand, and together they stepped down into the crowd. The light caught them as they moved, bathing them in that soft orange glow of late afternoon. It wasn't just two people leaving a courthouse. It felt like something larger. Like hope itself was walking down those steps. Because in that moment, the message was clear. This was never just about Marcus Hill. It was about what America chooses to be when the chains come out. About whether dignity and justice are reserved for the few or promised to us all. And as the sun dipped lower, people didn't see a director or a victim. They saw a man who had been humiliated, who had risen, and who had dared to turn his pain into a mirror for the nation. That image, the man and his wife walking into the light, stayed with me. And I think it stayed with everyone who saw it, because for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the end of a case. It felt like the beginning of change. And that, my friends, is the heart of this story. It's not just about Marcus or a courtroom twist. It's about what justice really means. It's about dignity, equality, and the reminder that no one should ever be treated as less in their own home, their own country, their own skin. If this story moved you, I ask you to do 3 simple things like this. Video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel, Mr. Max Stories. Every click, every share, every word of encouragement means more than you know. It's what fuels us to keep creating stories that shine a light on truth, justice, and the power of the human spirit. Here at Mr. Max Stories, we believe stories are more than entertainment. They are memory, they are voice, they are change. So when you think of us, think of that a place where every story leaves a mark. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.